Welcome to this fourth module and lecture in the course on technology and the psyche. This module is entitled The Art of Memory and the Renaissance Mage. Much of our reading will be from the book The Art of Memory by Frances Yates, who's pictured here. Dame Frances Yates lived from 1899 to 1981. Her specialties were the occult and Neoplatonic philosophies of the Renaissance, and she taught for many years at the University of London's Warburg Institute, which specializes in Renaissance studies. I feel she's one of the great scholars of the Renaissance occult tradition, and aside from The Art of Memory, she wrote The Rosicrucian Enlightenment, about the beginnings of the Rosicrucian movement, and a book called Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition. This is a portrait of Giordano Bruno, who was a Dominican friar who lived in the late 16th century. He was eventually, in the year 1600, burned at the stake by the Roman Inquisition for his heretical views, which included Copernican heliocentrism, and Frances Yates' book on him brilliantly shows how what we would think of as this modern scientific model of the solar system and the universe arose out of Bruno's interest in Hermeticism, the occult philosophy associated with Hermes Trismegistus, and before him with the trickster Hermes himself. We generally associate what we think of as technology with modern and contemporary science. So I think that it's critical in the context of this course that we examine the Hermetic, the alchemical, the occult origins of what we think of as quote-unquote objective science. There will be more on this in our second reading, which comes from Morris Berman's book, Coming to Our Senses. Returning to Frances Yates' Art of Memory, it's important first to note that memory is, in fact, a faculty of the soul or psyche, along with such other faculties of the psyche as imagination, intellection, perception, emotion, and so on. And in The Art of Memory, Frances Yates describes a techne, a technique or mental technology used in ancient, medieval, and Renaissance times to develop and improve this faculty of the soul. This art is said to have begun in ancient Greece with the lyric poet Simonides, who lived from 556 to 468 BC, and the incident depicted here in which a building collapsed on a group of people who were dining. Simonides had fortunately just left the building, as you can see depicted here, but was able to remember the names of everyone who was not so fortunate by bringing to mind visually where each one sat around the table. In the first chapter of her book, Frances Yates discusses 3 Latin treatises on the art of memory, 2 of which were either written by or attributed to this gentleman, Cicero. Cicero was, of course, one of the great orators and writers of the late Roman Republic. He was an enemy of Julius Caesar, and the imperial government that Caesar founded, eventually Cicero was murdered in 43 BC. The art of memory that Cicero describes and recommends relies on the creation of what's called a memory palace or memory theater. That is, you imagine a building with various nooks and crannies, as is depicted here, and then you place visual images that you associate, say, with parts of a speech that you're supposed to be giving from memory. and you go through your memory palace from nook to nook and room to room, corner to corner, remembering the images, which then remind you of what it was you were to have memorized. These images should be dramatic, artistic, something memorable. And as Cicero says, in this way, art will supplement nature. That is, techne will supplement the natural faculty of memory. Here is another depiction of a memory palace from Robert Fludd, spelled F-L-U-D-D, the English Renaissance physician and alchemist. There are many more descriptions of such memory palaces in Francis Yates' book. In his work on oratory, Cicero speaks of images penetrating the psyche, which I think very well encapsulates the positive impact of technique, art, craft on the psyche, and why this art of memory is such a good illustration of the interplay between technology and the psyche. These images are likened to those of the personae or masks in a theater. So the artistic and dramatic bent of this technology is very clear. The third Latin treatise on the art of memory that Francis Yates discusses is by this gentleman, Quintilian, who lived in Roman Spain from 35 to 100 AD. There's this marvelous quotation from Quintilian that begins, this achievement of Simonides appears to have given rise to the observation that it is an assistance to the memory if places are stamped upon the mind, which anyone can believe from experiment. For when we return to a place after a considerable absence, we not merely recognize the place itself, but remember things that we did there, and recall the persons whom we met, and even the unuttered thoughts which passed through our minds when we were there before. Thus, as in most cases, art originates from experiment. Experiment in this case is more or less synonymous with experience. This quote really strikes home for me. I've been living in Ojai for some time, but lived in LA for quite a long time before that. Whenever I go back to LA, which is pretty frequently, and drive down any number of streets, with almost every block there's a memory that gets evoked for me of some incident that happened at that place when I was living there, and I'm sure, or at least I can imagine, that this is something we can all relate to. In the next chapter, Yeats moves back from Rome to ancient Greece. The chapter is entitled The Art of Memory in Greece, Memory in the Soul. She starts with Aristotle, who is depicted here in a portrait by the Renaissance painter Raphael, and talks about his treatise called De Anima, or About the Soul. Aristotle's theory of memory and reminiscence is based on the theory of knowledge, which he expounds in his De Anima. The perceptions brought in by the five senses are first treated or worked upon by the faculty of imagination, and it is the images so formed that become the material of the intellectual faculty. Imagination is the intermediary between perception and thought. She goes on to say that Aristotle's statement that it is impossible to think without a mental picture is constantly brought in to support the use of images in mnemonics. And Aristotle himself uses the images of mnemonics in an illustration of what he is saying about imagination and thought. Thinking, he says, is something which we can do whenever we choose, for it is possible to put things before our eyes, just as those do who invent mnemonics and construct images. Yeats then goes on to discuss the function of memory in the philosophy of Plato, who is depicted here also by Raphael. She talks about two of his dialogues, the Phaedo and the Phaedrus, which are easy to confuse, the names, and says, Plato, unlike Aristotle, believes that there is a knowledge not derived from sense impressions, that there are latent in our memories the forms or molds of the ideas, of the realities which the soul knew before its descent here below. True knowledge consists in fitting the imprints from sense impressions onto the mold or imprint of the higher reality of which the things here below are reflections. The Phaedo develops the argument that all sensible objects are referable to certain types of which they are likenesses. We have not seen or learned the types in this life, but we saw them before our life began, and the knowledge of them is innate in our memories. So you can see how it might be considered an important thing to develop or delve into the memory. She goes on to say, in the Phaedrus, in which Plato expounds his view of the true function of rhetoric, which is to persuade men to the knowledge of the truth, he again develops the theme that knowledge of the truth and of the soul consists in remembering, in the recollection of the ideas once seen by all souls, of which all earthly things are confused copies. Memory is not a section of this treatise, as one part of the art of rhetoric. Memory in the Platonic sense is the groundwork of the whole. Yeats then returns to Cicero, who she says was not only the most important figure in the transfer of Greek rhetoric to the Latin world, but was also probably more important than anyone else in the popularizing of Platonic philosophy. Cicero takes up the Platonic and Pythagorean position that the soul is immortal and of divine origin. A proof of this is the soul's possession of memory, which Plato wishes to make the recollection of a previous life. Here is an illustration for one of Cicero's works, The Dream of Scipio, which is based upon one of Plato's myths that's recounted in the Republic. Both are about the descent of the soul from the Empyrean through the spheres of the cosmos and onto the earth. Yeats goes on to say, the technical terms of the artificial memory, that is the art of memory, come into the orator's mind, that is into Cicero's mind, when as philosopher he is proving the divinity of the soul. The soul's remarkable power of remembering things and words is a proof of its divinity. So also is its power of invention, not now in the sense of inventing the arguments or things of a speech, but in the general sense of invention or discovery. The things over which Cicero ranges as inventions represent a history of human civilization, from the most primitive to the most highly developed ages. This once again draws a line from Hermetic techne or technology to the nature and development of the soul, which, as we're about to see, comes up again in the Neoplatonic thought of the Italian Renaissance. The name of this module is The Art of Memory and the Renaissance Mage. So we'll turn in Francis Yates' book from ancient Greece and Rome to the Renaissance in chapter 6, Renaissance Memory, the Memory Theater of Giulio Camillo. Camillo is depicted here. He lived in the late 15th and early to mid 16th centuries, the height of the Italian Renaissance. He went to university in Bologna, but is most associated with the city of Venice, although he did live for a while in France under the patronage of King Francis I. In this chapter, Francis Yates gives us a really exquisite fold-out sketch of Camillo's Memory Palace, or Memory Theater. It's an actual theater where one or two people sit or stand upon the stage. And the amphitheater is a memory palace that actually is intended to help us remember the entire structure of the cosmos, both the macrocosmos, that is the universe, and the microcosmos, that is our own psyches. Camillo's memory theater is or was essentially a Neoplatonic technology for helping us to remember and therefore get more closely in touch with the solar psyche. The Neoplatonists, of course, were philosophers such as Cicero, who lived after Plato's time and developed his philosophy further. Neoplatonists include such great ancient philosophers as Plotinus. Their great quest was helping us to remember or realize who we were, quote unquote, before we woke up and found ourselves here on Earth in these human bodies. Neoplatonism experienced a revival in especially Renaissance Florence, most significantly with this gentleman, Marsilio Ficino, who lived from 1433 to 1499, that is a bit earlier than Camillo. Cosimo de' Medici decided to refound Plato's Academy in Florence, and he chose Ficino as its head. Ficino and many others learned ancient Greek from modern day, or at least contemporary Greek scholars of the day. He translated Plato from Greek into Latin, and also the Hermetic corpus, the Corpus Hermeticum of Hermes Trismegistus, and the writings of such ancient Neoplatonists as Plotinus. His main original work was a treatise on the immortality of the soul. In the memory theater, we see how the soul descends from the Empyrean down through the heavenly spheres and joins itself with the body. And in seeing this, we are aided in the process of the realization of our true and the soul's true nature. This process is called gnosis, the coming to knowledge, realization of who we really are. And the memory theater, like much of Platonic and Neoplatonic philosophical practice, such as the practice of the Socratic dialogue, these are techniques or technologies that promote gnosis. Our last reading this week is Chapter 7 of Morris Berman's book, Coming to Our Senses. The chapter is entitled Science and Magic, and here is Morris Berman, who was born in 1944. He's best known as a critic of contemporary American technological culture, and in this book he traces an historical pattern, a pattern of how Gnostic spirituality becomes calcified and degenerates into orthodoxy, and then through various Gnostic movements, this orthodoxy gets shaken up again. One example of this is what he calls the French model, which refers to the late medieval revolt against church scholasticism by the Gnostic sect of the Albigensians, or Cathars, who were eventually put down, but not before having generated the mythos of courtly love, which is, of course, a way of finding one's own soul by investing oneself in another and the soul of another. In the chapter we're reading, Berman moves on from the French model, which is probably better thought of as the Provençal or Southern French model, because that's where the Albigensians set up their churches, to what he calls the Italian model, which is that of the Renaissance mage that we have been discussing, including such figures as Giordano Bruno, whose art of memory was heliocentric. Berman talks about watershed figures and pre-watershed figures, people like Ficino and Camillo, and Bruno would be pre-watershed figures leading up to such watershed figures as Isaac Newton and the astronomer Kepler, whose invention of what we call the scientific method was inspired in large part by their interest in what we call magic, magic being the province of the mage. I find it fascinating that the force of gravity, which was quote unquote discovered by Newton, still remains one of the great mysteries unexplained even by the most advanced science of our age, whereas earlier it had been explained as being the pondus amoris, that is, the weight of love, the attraction between any two physical bodies being a function of love in the broader sense. What Berman points out is the Gnostic or psychical origins of modern science, and how also that science, which was at the time a radical break, has itself become an orthodoxy in need of Gnostic disruption. The point here that I've been trying to make over and over again is that there are many different aspects or perspectives on the relationship among technology, science, and the process of coming to know the psyche.